Welcome to EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for professionals advancing transportation electrification. To find out more about the show, visit atlasevhub.com/live. On today's episode, we'll be joined by Cassie Powers, Chief of Staff of the National Association of State Energy Officials, and Phil Jones, Executive Director of the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. They'll discuss what we can expect to happen in the year ahead, as well as offer some reflections on developments from 2024. Their perspectives as leaders in the EV industry are especially relevant now, as changes in Washington following November's election will likely result in changes to federal EV policy. Here's your host, founder of Atlas Public Policy, Nick Nigro.
Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome back to EV Hub Live. I'm your host, Nick Nigro, and I'm joined by two extreme subject matter experts on transportation electrification, Cassie Powers and Phil Jones. Really appreciate you both joining me here in January to talk about what we can expect this year in EVs in 2025. A lot happened right at the end of 24 that has gonna probably have a serious influence over what our priorities are, and we're gonna talk about all of those things. So first, welcome to the show. Thank you, Cassie and Phil, for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.
So I want to start with right into the federal infrastructure parts of policy and what might be changing in the near term. What we saw with the infrastructure law, of course, was a historic investment in charging infrastructure, $5 billion for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, up to $2.5 billion going into EV charging through the charging and fueling infrastructure discretionary program. There's actually an award for CFI just out this morning. Not going to be able to talk about that one today, but you can see that the current administration is trying to get as much of that money out the door as possible. With that said, what can we expect in terms of NEVI and CFI in 25 with the incoming Trump administration? And love to start with you, Cassie.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be chatting with you both. I, of course, will be here representing the state energy offices and the NASEO perspective. You know, over the coming months, we certainly see the states continuing to lead on EV infrastructure and EV program implementation. There's billions of dollars that have gone out through the NEVI program, now the CFI program, which is exciting. A significant portion of that has been obligated. It is already in the state's hands, and they are pushing it out. There's been a lot of progress made under the NEVI program in particular. Counter to some of the narrative in the press, the states are working hard and installing stations every day. NASEO, in partnership with AASHTO, the Joint Office, and Atlas, released a clearinghouse and an EV dashboard on evstates.org, which shows this progress. It shows the status of NEVI stations across the country, provides data on them, et cetera. And so there is a lot of progress. In the coming months, we certainly anticipate a potential pens down order from the administration. That is typical of any new administration that is coming in. They want to make sure that they get a handle on what's happening in programs. That won't stop the states from keeping going for the programs that are underway. We do anticipate that that NEVI and other EV programs they are keeping going for the coming years. And so this program, I believe, is funded through 2026 when the next service transportation reauthorization bill comes into play. And so at that point, we'll probably have a conversation about whether dedicated EV funding will be happening or whether it will be wrapped into some other programs, allowing states perhaps more flexibility in how they spend those dollars. It is anyone's guess. So a little bit of insight there.
Right on. Phil, what do you think?
I agree with everything my good friend Cassie said. She's really the expert on NEVI and BIL, but I'd just like to say a couple of things. One, you've been hearing a lot of things about possible headwinds from the federal administration coming in. And thank God we have a federalist governance structure in our country with some very strong delegated power to the states. When you think about how our country was founded, 13 colonies, equal rights. The first go didn't make it, but they got together in Philadelphia and developed a constitution that has withstood the test of time. So to Cassie's point, I think the states, especially the forward-leaning states, not all states, but the forward-leaning states are going to continue to lean in. And so whether it's NEVI funding or CFI funding, that will continue. We think that has a pretty strong lockbox on it. In terms of the other policies in the IRA that we're going to talk about next, the IRA, the emissions regulations, it's kind of up for grabs. And that makes me say something like, this is going to be a year with a lot of bumps in the road. And a lot of change. So the industry is changing too. The OEMs are changing. They're starting to make more plug-in EVs as well as full battery electric EVs. And as both of you know, as everybody knows, that's a different type of charging infrastructure, level 2 instead of DCFCs. It also I don't think the pace of growth is going to slow down. A lot of my commissioners that I talked to last year said, Phil, EV growth is slowing down. And I said, no, EV growth continues to increase at about 10, 15% a year. But yeah, the projections of several years ago of 40, 50% growth for 24, 23 were not achieved. So I think we're going to have good growth, Nick. But the mix of products is going to change and the type of charging infrastructure is going to change. So
before I go back to Cassie to talk more about what the energy offices are going to have in front of them, I want to stick with you, Phil, and follow up a little bit on what you were just talking about. There is a lot of concern, it sounds like, in the industry about the pace of change and how momentum might be sustained with the change in priorities here in Washington. What I'd love to hear from your perspective as a representative of a lot of companies, leading companies in this industry, what's different about 2025 versus 2017? And from the perspective of the companies, the infrastructure we have, the technology for electric vehicles, could you tell the audience a little bit more about how things might be different this time because the technology has advanced?
Yeah, the technology has advanced, and one of the issues we're going to be dealing with this year is it's kind of geeky, but I'm going to mention it, Nick, the plug on the cars or the plug on the charger. So we've made a pretty historic change from the SAE standard called J1772 to the new standard, also SAE, but Tesla pushed and was successful in getting a new plug standard. So Hyundai, many of the automakers, not all, are going to have those plugs installed at the factory before they ship to the dealer and the customer. I think that's a good thing. For those cars that don't have that, we're going to have to use adapters, or we're going to have solutions at the charging sites. ChargePoint has them, Electrify America, Tesla, all have devices that provide adapters built in. So that obviously is very different. One can argue that that's very confusing to a customer. Like the first time I used a magic dock of a Tesla station, I was confused.
Yeah.
But I got used to it. You download the app and it comes out and it works. So I think for the automakers, we're going to face some consumer education kind of confusion issues. I think the state DOTs, Cassie, and the state energy offices too are learning about some of the more technical aspects of this. The state energy offices have learned a lot about Title 23 on the DOT side, but the transportation folks really don't understand reliability and backup generation and how the electric grid works. So we're going to continue to face that friction and that learning that has to go forward over the next year or two. So I think that's different. I think overall my members are pleased with the amount of education that has happened. We all talked about 5% being a trigger. I never believed that, 5% of new sales. I think it's more like 8, 10, 12%. So once you get to 8, 10, 12% of new sales, that scale really happens. And then the infrastructure providers and the utilities need to step forward. Sorry.
Yeah. And Cassie, so Phil's really set you up. The NEVI program for some energy offices was a new thing. For some, it was just continuing what they had already done. I'd love for you to reflect a little bit on the last couple of years and also look ahead because you all have been instrumental in getting this infrastructure program to where it is today. As you mentioned, it might have started out slow, but they're nearing 900 to 1,000 charging stations have been awarded to date, and they're in construction across the country. So, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about what you've learned and what you expect to happen with the energy offices in 25.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a lot of learning in recent years. The energy offices, as you mentioned, have a long history of administering EV infrastructure programs, and in most states have served as really advisors to the NEVI program. There's a handful of states where the energy offices are the NEVI lead, but in most, they are advising. They're helping to bring the energy perspective to help figure out what questions need to be answered to connect to the grid, to get these stations safely, to kind of navigate the big web of EVSE providers and the vendors and whatnot. We have learned that there are a lot of things to learn through DOT funding in particular, as you had mentioned. I think that, that education curve has happened. The DOTs obviously know how to navigate those dollars. And I think it's just combining kind of the energy side of the house knowledge with the DOT side that is happening. I will mention that in addition to NEVI rollout, there's a lot of other work that is going on. And so EV charging stations absolutely are going in. There are a lot of state energy offices and states generally that are beginning to take a holistic look at what planning needs to be done to prepare for transportation electrification, not only of the passenger cars, which are well underway, but also medium and heavy duty and freight electrification. NASIO is working with Colorado and Missouri and Tennessee on helping to develop some freight electrification plans to make sure that they are convening industry, convening utilities, others to figure out what the next steps are for their states in this important work. They are also, of course, launching some wraparound activities as well. And so a lot of states are launching EV workforce training initiatives. The Georgia Energy Office is a great example. They have a curriculum that they've been working on with a college to help make sure that their workforce is ready. That dovetails, of course, with the massive investments in EV manufacturing that's happening across our country. And so the other thing I wanted to flag too is that in kind of what we've learned and where we're going next is there is going to be a lot of strategic planning around how vehicle electrification plays into the larger demand for energy that we're seeing across all sectors of the economy. So in addition to growth in transportation electrification, we're seeing growth in electrification of industry and buildings, and of course the ever-present AI and the data centers. How on earth are we to get electricity to those places? How will the demand in electric transportation contribute to overall planning for load growth in general? And so all of those are some things that that the states are beginning to plan for. But all that said, at the same time, they're also heads down working on rolling out charging stations. In addition to the DOTs and some of the energy offices under NEVI, the CFI awards, as you had mentioned, have been released. Round 2 was $630 million. 3 energy offices got those awards. A lot of cities across our country, which is very exciting. And so there's kind of work happening across multiple different tiers to make sure that transportation electrification is working.
I just have to, flag your comment about considering the load from all these different sources that are electrifying and including the build out of data centers. That's a really positive thing to hear. I know that I've been thinking a lot about how transportation electrification can be, planned in concert with all of this other new load that's coming on. And that brings me right back to you, Phil. Many of your members are the largest electric utility companies in the country. They are going to be playing a critical role in accommodating all of this load. You mentioned a moment ago that as the adoption rate increases, the utilities need to step up. So let's talk about the utilities right now. There's some data that shows that, at least from an approved program perspective, where, it's not a high point. This is data that we track on EV Hub, and it's basically looking at all the proceedings that are out there that are targeted at electric vehicles and how many have been approved for electric vehicle infrastructure investments. And it's very low as of last year. You can see that we were well over $1 billion for a few years there. And now we're it's a small fraction of that. And so I'd love for you to help everybody understand, what's going on. Is this an anomaly? Is this where we should expect things to be in 25? Expand on that a little bit.
No, and that's you raised some good points there, Nick. So utilities have been, when I started doing this work 5-6 years ago, the utilities were leaning in more, especially on the own and operate model, as well as make ready, as most of as many of you know, there are different ways that utilities can fund infrastructure. One is make ready, another is own and operate, another is a leasing model. You can work with third-party vendors. There are quite a few ways that utilities can do this. So even some of those national numbers, Nick, are a little bit hard to track sometimes. But I would agree with you that in the last 2 years, the numbers have gone down a little bit. Okay, why? Well, I call it data centers and AI. They've become the shiny new object of attention. The loads are much bigger, right? So instead of a 600 kilowatt load of a NEVI charging station, as Cassie knows, some of these data centers are coming to utilities and asking for almost a gigawatt or megawatts, hundreds of megawatts of power. So obviously that gets the utilities' attention quickly. Can they serve that load quickly? How quickly can they build new infrastructure? If they have to build new substations and feeders, that is a complicated process. So I would say a couple of things. Data centers, AI have kind of sucked the oxygen out of the room a little bit. I think it's coming back. The meetings I've been to in the last few months, we're having a more balanced discussion about, okay, data centers, AI are here, transportation electrification is here, building electrification is here, industry and agriculture electrification, and marine transportation is here. So I think we're getting to have a more balanced discussion. Second problem is affordability. If you look at electric rates, in order to make, especially with the high capital costs of EVs at the beginning, people just don't listen to our arguments on TCOs, total cost of operation over 12 years of a vehicle. You know, they're kind of short term. And so they just look at the sticker price, right? The MSRP. And the fact of the matter is that until recently, most EVs were about $7,000, $8,000 more expensive than ICE cars, traditional cars. So that's a deterrent. So you need to have the electricity price be cheaper, frankly, than the gasoline or diesel price to make the use case work, especially in the early years. And in some states like Connecticut, California, I won't mention any more, the rates of inflation and new generation coming on and building more transmission have brought that up. So we really need to focus on the affordability. When I talk to state commissioners, that's the first word out of their mouth, right? Why should utilities invest more in capital, which goes into rate base, which increases the rates, when private parties or the federal government, like with Cassie, has been working so hard on NEVI and CFI, a lot of commissioners are saying the feds can do it. And so utilities don't need to do it. So I think, frankly, that if the Fed step back, this is an opportunity for the utilities to invest more. Third thing, and I'll just mention this briefly, you've all heard about the regulatory model, the utility model.
Maybe not all of us, Phil, but at least the folks in this room have. Yeah.
Well, I'll just mention that utility commissioners, and I was one for 12 years, are very cautious in terms of approving too much in rate base or in rates. Operating costs, capital costs. And so this has become, as I just said, a big issue recently. And there's also a concept called used and useful. And I'll just explain it like this. In order for a plant asset like a transformer or a substation or a feeder to be put into rates, it has to be used and useful. It has to be energized and used with electrons flowing. Traditionally one way, but we're going to have more bidirectional in the future. Anyway, it has to be used. And so that's what we're trying to do in states like Massachusetts, California, is change the regulatory model to give the commissions comfort that our load predictions, that our data analysis is really good. And we think there's a pretty high probability that there's going to be a fleet depot charging station in this neighborhood. And therefore, utility X needs to spend $50 million or $75 million to build a new substation, or $5 million to upgrade a feeder, or to do something like that. But that, Nick, I think that's a real opportunity, and we're just starting with that. Well, we're not just starting with the conversation, it's going on in several states, but we need to, spread that around across the country.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that you bring up too, Phil, because one of the big barriers for transportation electrification, at least from a power access standpoint, is the timing, right? It takes the utility several years potentially to get the power to that site, while it might take a vehicle manufacturer several months. And so aligning those things is very hard given the regulatory structure that the utilities operate under, as you mentioned. So Cassie, I want to bring you back in and talk about some of that, as you've seen with NEVI, going back to some of the lessons learned around utility engagement and such. If you're let's say you're a NEVI applicant within a state, or you're an applicant to the federal awards through CFI, you're not going to know if you're going to get that money until the award is issued. But then, of course, once the award is issued, the expectation is you're going to get going on construction, but you might have a long line with the utility to get in the queue in order to get the power that you needed to do the station. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about maybe some of the things you've seen in states to help address that challenge.
Definitely. And just to underscore that point, when NEVI was first getting off the ground and we were bringing in states that had significant experience with EV infrastructure development to share some lessons learned, one of the first kind of realities that the states wanted to share was that it can take a couple of years to open a station from the time a contract is signed. So forget about the amount of time it takes to even get the contract signed. Once it's signed, it could take a couple of years, and it's because it takes a long time to work with partners and to work through the permitting process, et cetera. And so it can just take a while, and we do need to speed up that timeline. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. The utility engagement piece, states across the country have been working hand in glove with their utilities to electrify these sites. There are different models that we're seeing emerge. A number of states require that the applicant coordinate with the utility and do a utility site assessment, or a pre-assessment, I should say, to really kind of get a gut check almost on whether this site is easy to electrify or not. And if it's not, it's probably not going to score that high because it's going to take too long, it's going to cost too much, et cetera. We're seeing that model across a number of different states. The level of engagement of utilities, it depends on the service territory. Some of the IOUs are deeply engaged, same with the rural co-ops, same with the munis. There isn't one set rule across the country. But when you do have a site assessment or a pre-assessment early to kind of identify the low-hanging fruit sites, that's really important. And that can help to speed up this process quite a bit.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I obviously understand the interest in trying to do the sort of low hanging fruit, as you said, first. Getting to mass adoption, though, is going to require us to do some of the harder stuff. And I think there's a school of thought out there that public dollars are in place in part not to necessarily just do the low hanging fruit, but they're also there to make sure that everyone has equitable access to charging. So Phil, I'd love to go back to you on that and just, reacting to what you heard from Cassie there on, how the states are able to implement the NEVI program now. How do we get over this hump here, this potential delay that we might get in getting charging out into the ground, into the field, particularly in medium and heavy duty, where, the loads could be in the many megawatts relative to the light duty segment.
Well, the first thing we have to do is get dockets going and get workshops going in all the states to focus on this energization timing issue. California's taken the lead. Obviously, it's been kind of a hotspot because that's where all of the vehicle incentives are, and that's where adoption has increased the most rapidly. So it is educating the commissioners, the staff, all the stakeholders about what are the key issues, because you get into issues like easements, legal issues, land analysis. Some of these sites are complicated, Nick, as you know. You have a landlord, but the landlord's not there. You have a convenience store, but they don't own the land. There's a agreement between them, and then you have a host site, and then you have city inspectors that the cities want to inspect this. There's conventional fuel. How close can the electricity get? So we have a whole variety of local government and other issues that need to be addressed. And as Cassie said, if you can do this ahead of time in the pre-planning of the site, that's better. But utilities can help. They can provide hosting capacity maps, for example. So if you go on the DOE website and some other things, there's an atlas of hosting capacity maps. It's not a panacea. Frankly, I tell developers this all the time. You probably are still going to have to do an engineering study and a site visit to really determine if that feeder and the capabilities are such to accommodate 600 kW or 750 or whatever the load's going to be. The other issue is interim. So I'm not a big fan of interim. Some people call this flexible interconnection, but interim interconnection means that if you, let's say you have a 50 megawatt load, the utility cannot satisfy 50 megawatts in 2025, but it can satisfy 15 or 10. So you start with 10, 15, and then you work on a schedule where the utility can procure more transformers, feeders, switchgear to actually build that up. And you put that either in a contract or an order of a commission. So the commissions are not really knowledgeable enough about that yet, and we're spending quite a bit of time to say, hey, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be all hours of the year, all months, but you can kind of sequence it in. Some utilities like Southern California Edison have a kind of a 2 megawatt substation or a 1 megawatt on a skid, and these are sold in the commercial market now. So you can move these generators around, if you will, to the sites where you need them, and then you can take them where they need to be. So anyway, I guess what I'm saying is we need to educate, we need to bring all the stakeholders on board. If the utility can't do it, then some developers are going off grid for a few years, and so you put a solar canopy or a bunch of solar out there, you put some batteries in, you aren't directly interconnected with the grid. And so there are some developers out there, as you know, who are doing that. I'm not opposed to that, but what I tell developers is, when we have a wildfire like we have in California now, or we have data centers coming in, or onshoring of manufacturing that's developing even more power, at some point you probably will become interconnected with the grid, but maybe for a short period of time.
Yeah.
And Phil, I want to double down on that last point, that there are significant opportunities right now to use new technologies to bring these stations online, bring these depots online. The hundreds of megawatt heavy duty stations that we're going to be seeing, they're coming. And there might be opportunities to add a microgrid to the site, to island the site, to add generation and storage. And we are seeing that. The Bakersfield site in California is one prime example. And agreed that it's kind of, while it will be important to be connected to the grid in times of emergencies, it's also important to not be, and to provide another site that people can go and act as a critical facility. In addition to charging the stations and charging the vehicles, that can also be a place where people can go when there is an emergency. And so looking at it through that lens may also present some new policy opportunities in addition to the regulatory opportunities to push electrification along.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially in an emergency case, some emergency funding being used to allocate to justify those kind of expenses when you're in a place that's prone to issues, which unfortunately now is increasingly almost everywhere. Okay, we're almost running up against time, and I want to make sure we get to some of the risks we're going to be facing in the near term. And there is going to be policy change here in Washington. The extent to which it is, things are changing, in the timeline in which those changes might come is obviously unknown right now, but there certainly is risk. And so I want to give you both the floor, the opportunity to talk about what you see as some of the bigger risks that we're looking at in transportation electrification. It doesn't have to be just about our nerd out conversation on utilities and infrastructure and charging. Can be about anything transportation related. And I want to start with you, Phil. Go ahead.
I think I mentioned this in the beginning, but some sort of certainty in the planning. And so if a consumer is expecting a $7,500 tax credit, that should be forthcoming. And if there's going to be a change, it shouldn't be rapid. The OEMs have been building, and I think of Hyundai, especially in Georgia, at its Georgia plant. It initially didn't qualify for the 30, what we call the 30D federal tax credit, but they spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build up their capabilities at the plant so they would be ready for model year 25. Guess what? They're ready.
Yep.
And I think it's terribly unfair, and it's not good for business. It's a big risk if we have these rapid changes where you say, oh, well, that doesn't apply anymore. So that's number one. Number two is, how are we going to work collaboratively in a collaborative way on this? Because these are pretty big silos themselves, transportation, electric utilities, independent power producers, transmission, charging station operators. So if we don't have a common guidepost, either at the state or federal level, it becomes more difficult for everybody to work together for the common good, right? And so the federal government has an important role to play, even if they don't have money, Nick. If they can enable us, if they can bring us together at the state and private level, it's really, really helpful. And of course, Cassie and I know about this. As a former utility regulator, we really worked hard with the federal government, U.S. Department of Energy and EPA on all sorts of stuff, on things like smart thermostats, energy efficiency, how to improve the efficiency of the delivery system of energy. So I would say that's a risk. The other risk that we have is, just kind of technical stuff, like can stuff operate together? Is the data shared? Some of these new software companies, they survive on data, right? And so they're willing to share that data with a state agency, but under certain conditions. And they think some state agencies, frankly, are asking for way too much data. And they're saying, why do you need this data? We're willing to give it to you. So we have kind of those issues where we need to get these sectors. I guess what I'm saying is the sectors have not collaborated in the past, and now they really need to collaborate much more closely.
Cassie, what do you think?
No, I agree with everything that Phil had mentioned. We are likely to see some rollbacks in some of the regulations. The California waiver certainly is one significant possibility. We'll see what happens with the credits. There's a lot of tax incentives that are benefiting businesses in red and blue districts. And so we'll see what happens at the end of the day, whether those are rolled back or modified, but that's certainly on the table. In addition, I think that there are some risks to the advanced clean truck rule as well. And so that is one where while the passenger vehicle market is farther along and certainly well on its way, medium and heavy duty is TBD. Those vehicles are also on their way, but not nearly as established. And so without strong federal regulation, we'll see if that continues. Beyond that, I also wanted to flag that in addition to some of the federal changes, though, we are likely to see continued work at the state level. And so there are a lot of opportunities to keep this work going. There was a lot of progress in previous years where there weren't strong rules and regulations and leadership on EVs from the federal level, and that was okay. The states plowed ahead. We saw the emergence of coalitions of blue states, of red states. We saw states in the Intermountain West launch EV initiatives because they were interested in capturing EV tourism. That is something that is important, and it will continue. And so I think that there are still a number of opportunities out there to advance transportation electrification.
All right. Well, really, Phil, did you want to jump in?
Well, I just want to accentuate very quickly Cassie's last point on medium heavy duty and ACT. California just is enforcing ACT, as you probably read, Cassie. And so Daimler is not shipping any diesel trucks in Oregon right now. It's caused a big shock. New Jersey, on the other hand, the legislature, people have been lobbying the legislature to delay the implementation of the rules by 2 years. So I think we're going to have, this is a risk, I would say, Nick, is we're going to have an uneven application of some of these environmental regulations like ACT and ACT 2. And that's not good for the industry. That's not good for the charging providers.
Yeah. There's a word that that industry often uses and when they talk to government, and that is consistent, predictable, because they make plans that are decades in advance, and they want to make sure they earn a return on those investment decisions. And when things are jumping all around all the time, that can really hurt. So I hear that loud and clear. Well, with that, we're going to close this episode out. I want to just say thank you again to both Cassie and Phil for joining me on EV Hub Live to talk about what we expect to happen with EVs in 2025. Stay tuned for our next episode. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.